As the evening sun illuminated the tarmac with its golden rays, Barron Trump sat peacefully in the opulent first-class cabin and looked out the window. Barron was so preoccupied that he hardly noticed the hum of the boarding passengers. The silence was abruptly broken by a loud, combative voice. The pilot's sharp voice sliced through the air like a blade as he yelled, "Excuse me, but what is he doing here?" He was giving Barron a glare. Eyes darted between the young man and the pilot as the passengers froze. To avoid missing the unexpected turn of events that completely altered the course of events, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're curious about how this all happened and what comes next. Barron looked up, calm but bewildered. His voice was steady as he asked, "Is there a problem, sir?" But it was clear that there was tension in the room. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin as the pilot hissed, "Yes, there is a problem. People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity ride." Barron's heart fell, but not for him because he had always been scrutinized and criticized. This was nothing new. He noticed the pilot's eyes were filled with hatred. It was something more profound and unsightly than his seat. Whispering among themselves, some passengers took out their phones to capture the action. An older woman seated nearby moved toward Barron and whispered, "Are you okay, young man?" Barron nodded, delivering a nice grin, but the pilot wasn't done. He went closer, pointing a finger at Barron like a judge pronouncing a sentence. "I don't care who you are. You're not staying in this cabin. Either you move, or I'll have you removed from this flight." At that point, Barron's placid manner transformed. He rose up carefully, his big form commanding attention. The muttering stopped. All eyes were on him. "Sir," he responded, his voice firm but measured, "I have a ticket for this seat. I belong here as much as anyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." The pilot laughed, crossing his arms. "We'll see about that." He rushed off into the cockpit, leaving a trail of anxiety behind him. The passengers were visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared to intervene. Barron sat back down, his hands resting on the armrests. He wasn't angry, he was calculating. Something about this man's hostility didn't sit right, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Everyone on board was unaware that a storm was building, not only in the atmosphere, but also in the emotions of those who were watching this altercation. What was about to happen next would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew. The anxiety persisted in the cabin like a storm cloud, even after the minutes had passed. His comments remained thick in the air, but the pilot had not yet returned. Barron saw the nervous looks he was getting from the people. While some appeared reluctant, uncertain of how to respond, others appeared sympathetic. Barron was hesitantly approached by the flight attendant, a young woman with a worried smile. "Sir," she said softly, bending slightly, "is everything okay? I heard the captain say, if you'd like, I can see about moving you to another seat." Barron gave her a look that was momentarily unreadable. The attendant nodded, a trace of admiration showing on her face, but her worry persisted. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to be here." She added, "Just let me know if you need anything," and hurried back down the aisle. Then something unexpected occurred. The pilot's voice crackled across the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing a delay. There's a security concern we need to address." Barron froze. Security concern? The pilot's earlier animosity finally made clear. He wasn't just being disrespectful. He was trying to depict Barron as a threat, a planned maneuver aimed to legitimize his conduct. As rumors circulated, passengers started whispering once more, their voices becoming louder. On the other side of the aisle, a man bent forward. With a curious yet uneasy tone, he inquired, "Is he talking about you?" Instead of responding, Barron grabbed his phone and launched the camera app. He wanted to make sure there was a record in case things got out of hand. At that moment, 2 airport guards got on the aircraft. The whispers became a buzzing sound. Barron observed the officers moving along the aisle while glancing at each passenger. They came to a halt before him. One of them said, "Sir," in a forceful but professional tone, "we need you to come with us." Barron's heart raced, but he kept it to himself. Calmly, he rose to his feet, his massive bulk causing the police to pause for a second. He asked, "Can I ask why?" The officer said, "We've been informed of a potential issue, insufficiently. The passengers were hushed now, their eyes flitting between Barron and the officers. Some appeared in rage, others merely stunned. However, a single voice pierced the silence. Barron had heard the elderly woman say, "This is ridiculous," before. Anger flooded her face as she rose to her feet. Her outburst appeared to encourage others. "That boy hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. It's the pilot who's out of line," she exclaimed. The officers exchanged apprehensive looks as a man in a business suit said, "Yeah, I've been sitting here the whole time. He's done nothing but mind his own business." This was not what they had anticipated. One of them spoke into his radio, clearly trying to figure out how to handle the escalating situation. Barron remained composed, but inside he was shaken. Not because of the confrontation, he was used to being a target, but because of the people standing up for him. Strangers who didn't owe him anything, but refused to stay silent. However, the pilot had not fully extended his hand. Whatever was coming next wasn't just about Barron, it was about something far bigger, and the truth was about to come tumbling down. As the confrontation proceeded, the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The passengers' outspoken support for Barron obviously caught the security guards off guard as they paused. The weight of dozens of eyes caused one to shift uneasily, while the other looked away momentarily to talk into his radio. Barron, however, stayed upright, his composed expression a sharp contrast to the mayhem all around him. The elderly woman who had previously spoken up for him wasn't finished yet. Her voice was forceful as she stepped closer. "I don't care who you think you are. This young man has been polite and quiet the entire time. If anyone should be escorted off this plane, it's that pilot," she said with a thunderclap. As the muttering intensified, additional travelers started to join in, raising their voices in a chorus of outrage. "She's right," exclaimed one. The pilot abruptly returned, his face flushed with rage. "We've all seen what's happening here," he exclaimed. "Enough!" he yelled, his voice piercing the chaos. His palm trembled with anger as he aimed straight at Barron. Barron turned to face him, his eyes unwavering and firm. "I don't care what these people say. This flight doesn't leave until he's off the plane," he said. His voice was calm but loud enough for everyone to hear as he said, "And why is that?" The question hung in the air, laden with implication. Is it because of something I've done, or is it because of who you think I am? After a brief moment of hesitation, the pilot's face stiffened. He yelled, "Don't play games with me. I know trouble when I see it, but you might have everyone else fooled." The cabin erupted in a frenzy. Some passengers demanded answers, while others yelled over one another for the captain to be removed. The security guards appeared overpowered and unsure about how to take back control. Then a man at the cabin's rear sprang to his feet. He was elderly, his face worn, and he had the air of someone who had been through a lot. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouted in a powerful, authoritative voice. Heads turned toward him, and the ruckus died down. He went on. "I recognize that young man," gesturing to Barron. They all gasped as they said, "And I think the rest of you do too. That's Barron Trump, son of the former president of the United States." The cabin echoed. As the realization set in, Barron had a feeling of uneasiness. He didn't feel embarrassed about who he was, but he had wished to stay out of the spotlight and just be himself without the stigma attached to his last name. A sneer distorted the pilot's face. "That doesn't give him the right to act entitled." "So what?" the older man retorted. "Entitled?" The security guards appeared to realize that things were changing. "The only one acting entitled here is you. I don't care who he is or isn't. Your behavior is unacceptable," they said. One of them moved forward and spoke directly to the pilot. Before he could reply, a different voice broke the tension. "Sir, we need to de-escalate this situation. If you continue to provoke the passengers, we may have to ask you to leave," the pilot exclaimed. Barron did it this time. With a calm tone, he stated, "I think we've had enough drama for one flight." The pilot appeared to have been slapped. "If you'd like me to leave, I will. But know this, every moment of this has been recorded, and I won't let your actions go unanswered," he said. Passengers started holding up their phones as the cabin echoed once more, with some openly, recording the altercation. The whole plane seemed to be holding its breath for a moment. Then something unexpected occurred. The cabin cheered, but Barron remained motionless as one of the security guards turned to him and said, "You don't have to go anywhere, sir. Please take your seat." He had a feeling that this was not yet over. Barron could see that whatever came next would be the pilot's last desperate move, and his eyes were burning with rage. The pilot smashed a fist on the cabin wall, his face flushed red as his rage bubbled over. He screamed, "This is my plane!" His voice breaking under the intensity of his fury. "I decide who stays and who goes." The applause from the audience gave way to shocked gasps. Passengers' contempt for the pilot spread like wildfire as they started speaking to each other. The older man in the rear got back up and put up his hand to stop the muttering. "Your plane?" he asked in a firm yet acerbic tone. The pilot stepped back, momentarily unable to think of anything to say. "Last I checked, this plane belongs to the airline, not to your ego. You're supposed to be a professional, but all I see is a man drunk on power trying to humiliate someone who hasn't done a thing wrong." It stung. His silence, however, was short-lived. He yelled, "This isn't about power." Barron interrupted, his tone calm but forceful. "It's about rules, and I'm the one who enforces them." "Rules?" he asked. The pilot paused, his gaze flitting anxiously about the cabin. "What rule did I break? Tell everyone here what I've done to deserve being singled out like this," he said. In actuality, he had no valid response. Personal prejudice had motivated his acts, and now he was striving to escape the weight of public scrutiny. A security guard moved up and spoke directly to the pilot. He said, "Sir, you need to calm down," in a firm yet professional tone. "You're causing a commotion, and it's our responsibility to guarantee the security of all passengers." The pilot's expression contorted in shock. "You're taking his side?" he said in a poisonous tone. "According to the officer, we're taking the side of what's right." The passengers cheered, their support for Barron increasing stronger by the second. "And right now, you're the one jeopardizing this flight," they exclaimed. The pilot, who was obviously outnumbered and outmatched, urgently searched the area for support, but nobody came forward. Before one of the flight attendants, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke, they exchanged anxious looks. "Captain," she murmured quietly, regrettingly, "I think it's best if you step aside. This situation has escalated far beyond what's acceptable." The pilot's jaw tightened, and for a brief time, it appeared as though he may lash out once more. However, a change occurred in his expression. Maybe it was the knowledge that he had lost control, or maybe it was the pressure of the passenger's criticism. He eventually gave in, whatever it was. He spat, "Fine," his words brimming with resentment. After saying, "Let him stay, but this isn't over," he bounded out of the cabin, leaving a trail of stunned stillness in his wake. For the first time since the ordeal started, Barron's shoulders relaxed as he let out a deep breath. He turned and smiled slightly appreciatively at the passengers. "Thank you," was all he said. The elderly woman who had previously stood up for him extended her arm and put a reassuring palm on his. She said, "You didn't deserve any of this," with warmth. Barron nodded, his appreciation clear in his eyes. "And don't worry, we'll make sure the world knows what really happened here." However, he couldn't get rid of the impression that the pilot's menacing final remarks were more than simply threats as he sat down. He had a feeling that the fight was far from done. Barron couldn't help but wonder what the pilot would do next and how it would affect not only him, but also everyone else on board when the jet eventually got ready to take off. The anxiety in the cabin was finally starting to ease as the jet rose gently into the sky. Some of the passengers even smiled encouragingly at Barron as they exchanged relieved looks. However, a sense of anxiety persisted despite the serene exterior. Barron couldn't get the pilot's final words out of his head like a warning bell. Providing drinks and snacks as they went along the aisles, the flight attendant's professionalism concealed the chaos that had just broken out. In an attempt to keep his focus on the here and now, Barron took a glass of water and brushed his fingertips against the cup. The old veteran who had initially defended him lifted his cup in a silent toast of camaraderie across the aisle. The man murmured quietly, "Keep your head up," with an air of wisdom gained from years of adversity. Barron nodded, and a small smile formed on his lips as he said, "Bullies like him thrive on fear, but you showed courage today." "Thank you," was his response. But it didn't. "I just hope this ends here." The cabin began to feel uneasy when a muffled ruckus from the cockpit occurred 35 minutes into the flight. The flight attendants' calm exteriors cracked just a little as they whispered to one another in a hurry. The others were left to tell passengers that everything was all right after one of them vanished behind the cockpit door. No, it wasn't. The intercom suddenly came alive. The pilot's barely controlled rage added to the already tense atmosphere as he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." He went on, "I want to apologize for the earlier disruption," in an inauthentic tone. The barely veiled barb at Barron sparked additional whispers as the passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. "But let me remind everyone that rules exist for a reason. Some people think they're above them, but they're not," they said. However, Barron maintained his composure and fixed his focus on the front of the aircraft. The discomfort persisted even after the intercom unexpectedly stopped working. The jet suddenly jerked a few minutes later, causing the cabin to erupt in gasps. In an attempt to soothe everyone, a flight attendant rushed down the aisle with a pale face, saying, "Just a little turbulence." She forced a smile that stopped short of her eyes. Barron, however, was not persuaded. He had a gut feeling that something was wrong, really wrong. Then he saw it, the shadow of the pilot, pacing back and forth like a caged animal through the frosted glass of the cockpit door. The veteran spoke in a low whisper as he leaned in Barron's direction. Nodding, Barron felt his heart race with adrenaline. "That man's unhinged. He's not done yet. You need to be ready for anything," he said. He had previously been the subject of intense criticism, public scrutiny, and unfair treatment. But this time was different. This was a safety issue, not merely a reputational issue. The tension within the plane became intolerable as it resumed its steady trajectory. Then, seemingly at the same moment, the door of the cockpit flew open and crashed against the wall. The pilot stood there, breathing heavily and with wild eyes. He said, "All right," loudly enough for everyone to hear. The pilot rushed down the aisle, staring at Barron before anyone could respond. "If no one else is going to do something, I will," he said. The passengers let out gasps and screams of terror, but none dared to move. As the pilot leaned over Barron, his face contorted with anger, the tension peaked. With a low, sneering voice, the pilot asked, "You think you're untouchable?" Before he could move another step, the old veteran sprung to his feet and positioned himself squarely between Barron and the pilot. "Think again," he added. His voice was firm and unflinching. The cabin plunged into horrified silence when the words, "You've gone far enough," were spoken. The two guys, one representing power gone feral and the other a silent hero defending the moral high ground, had all eyes on them. In addition to defining the remainder of the flight, what transpired next would permanently alter everyone on board. Barron was aware that this was no longer solely about him, and the stakes were bigger than before. Regardless of the consequence, this was about speaking up against injustice. The veteran stood up, his eyes meeting the pilot's, and the tension in the cabin was electrifying. The passengers' anxiety and incredulity were evident as they watched with bated breath. While the pilot's anger boiled just below the surface, everyone else seemed to find optimism in the veteran's uncompromising attitude. The veteran remarked in a cool but firm voice, "You've crossed the line." The pilot tightened his lips into a sneer and said, "Sit down and do your job, or I'll make sure you never fly again." But before he could respond, a young woman got up and grabbed her phone. With a shaky but determined voice, she declared, "I've recorded everything." As she said, "If you don't stop, this goes online and your career is over." Others in the cabin raised their phones in response, some of them live streaming the commotion. The pilot stumbled, looking quickly at the phones aimed at him. He roared, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. "You think you can threaten me?" he asked. Something firmly said, "That's enough," from behind. The lead flight attendant was there, with two of her co-workers at her sides. The pilot paused and clenched and unclenched his hands, saying, "Captain, get back to the cockpit now, or we'll have no choice but to restrain you." Although it was evident that he was considering his choices, he had limited options due to the mounting support for Barron and the possibility of public exposure. The pilot growled in exasperation and rushed back toward the cockpit after realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched. Over his shoulder he spat, "You'll regret this," and slammed the door. The cabin let out a collective sigh of relief, yet the strain persisted. The veteran put a comforting hand on Barron's shoulder and turned to face him. He remarked, "You handled yourself well, son." With his appreciation clear, Barron nodded. "Don't let people like him get to you." In spite of the chaos, he said, "I couldn't have done it without you," in a firm voice. The passengers gathered around Barron as the trip went on, giving him words of encouragement and support. The video was shared by the young woman who had captured the incident, and it quickly became widely popular. Following the story's coverage by news outlets, hashtags like "Mrihorn Now Stand with Barron" and "Turn Now Justice in the Skies" started trending globally. Reporters and fans had gathered at the terminal by the time the jet touched down. Barron was greeted with clapping and cheering as he got off the aircraft. The veteran, a silent rock of support, strolled next to him. With a microphone in hand, one reporter rushed forward. Barron paused and looked around the room, asking, "Barron, what do you have to say about what happened on the flight?" "This isn't just about me," he added, the gravity of the situation evident in his voice. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Barron and the veteran left, inspiring the globe with their bravery and tenacity. "It's about standing up to injustice, no matter where it happens. No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human. We're all in this together," the crowd exclaimed. Barron remained in his hotel room later that night, reading through innumerable notes of encouragement. Although he was aware that the battle against discrimination and injustice was far from ended, this was a positive start. And as he closed his eyes, he came to the sobering realization that sometimes the most significant victories come from the most unexpected struggles. Standing up, even when it's difficult, can make a big difference in those situations.